Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for your support. And I'll get it out of the way right away. Please go to jeffersonhour.com if you are of a mind to support the show. Click on donate. There are a number of options, and we so appreciate it and we so need it. So thank you all for doing that. And if you are not interested in supporting the show financially, just write to us. Give us your thoughts, your criticisms, your suggestions. I can tell you I read every piece of mail we get. And with that, sir, what do you have to say?
Well, any acreage they happen to have in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, a snowblower from time to time, bags of honey, wine, you name it. But we love the support that we get. We don't do this for profit, thank goodness, because there is none. It's a labor of love. It's something that is of just extraordinary importance to me. I want to say, looking back and looking forward, as one should in January, that 2020, the most disruptive year of my life, and I expect that's the case of everyone, turned out to be a golden year for the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And I feel that even though we had to address some things that were difficult and, in a sense, dragged us a little out of the center of Jefferson's world, I think we did some of the best programs we've ever done in 2020. I give, of course, a lot of credit to Dr. Joseph Ellis, the returning champion, who is located at an undisclosed property in the Green Mountains of Vermont. But we had a great year, and I think we're going to have an even greater year in 2021. We certainly started off appropriately. We've gone back to the well of Mr. Jefferson, but we've talked about his first inauguration, which is a truly fascinating day in American history, and it led to one of the greatest of all inaugural addresses. And then we have talked this time about Jefferson's cabinet, and I don't think we've ever done it in quite this way. Certainly, we've never looked at the room where these cabinet meetings were held, and when you see and hear what that room was like, it's so charming, it's so droll and imaginatively fascinating and creative. You just think, what would it be like to be in the presence of a genius of creativity like Thomas Jefferson? You know, in a certain sense, David, his presidency is the least interesting episode of his life because he's so very interesting.
Yeah, I have to give credit to Lindsay Chervinsky, a former guest on the Thomas Jefferson Hour. She had a great book out last year and came on the program and talked to us. The cabinet. In researching the program, I came up with an article she'd written for the White House Historical Association. It was a great resource of information. Just a short article, but there was a lot of great stuff in it. We need to get her back on again.
Now, she's a young woman of extraordinary insight, a good writer. Her first book was on Washington's cabinet, but I think that Washington's cabinet is not as interesting as Jefferson's cabinet. I think that if her next book is on Jefferson's cabinet, it's going to be a very significant contribution to Jefferson's studies. I mean, she is just starting out, and it's so much fun to be talking to Joseph Ellis at the end of a long and extraordinarily distinguished career, and then sort of in the same breath talking to this young woman who's at the beginning of what I think is going to be a great career.
It's been great the last couple of weeks to talk to Jefferson again. There are those listeners of the Jefferson Hour who have been unhappy with us in the past year because so much of the discussion was about current politics, but it was really unavoidable. But it felt real good to return to a couple of weeks of conversations with President Jefferson. I enjoyed it immensely. And also to hear him talk about the peaceful transition of power.
You know, Jefferson set the tone for that in 1801, that this was the first transfer of power in American constitutional history. It worked pretty well, but Jefferson never got over the fact of the late appointments, the midnight appointments of John Adams, including Chief Justice John Marshall, and he never quite forgave Adams for not showing up for his inaugural. But, you know, he paid him back, as we saw last week. He didn't mention poor John Adams in his first inaugural address. I think that was a bit of a low blow. I think he should have said something respectful of Adams in his first inaugural address. He gave a lot of credit to George Washington and never mentioned his predecessor whatsoever. So the more things change, the more things stay the same, I guess.
Moving towards the show this week, again, it's Jefferson's first cabinet. I've already done my pitch this week. Before we go to the show, are there any updates you would like to share, sir?
Cuba, 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 Cuba. There's room on that trip. We're going. It's fantastic. This is the time. They're hungry for us. We've worked out all the diplomatic and COVID issues. It's a simple thing. And the guy who's leading it is a master. And then the Constitution course, if you're interested in really assessing where the U.S. Constitution is now and where we're headed, this is the course. I did it in the fall, and it was, as you know, a smash hit. It was the most successful course I've ever taught. People were just hungry to discuss these things. And we did some current events, but mostly we grounded all of this in the historical record. It's a fascinating subject. It takes you from the founding fathers in Philadelphia to Roe v. Wade and the Brown versus Board of Education to proposed constitutional amendments in our own time. It's amazing. It's just an amazing subject. It's infinitely rich, and it's not at all dry. It's like we're living it for the first time in my lifetime. We are really living the Constitution of the United States in a big, big, big way. And so if you're interested, now's the time to sign up. You can go to jeffersonhour.com for Cuba for the Constitution courses. Then there will be a course on Hamlet. There will be a course on North Dakota and the Great Plains. And then the 2 summer jaunts, one on the Lewis and Clark Trail and the other one on the River of No Return, the Salmon River, Class 4 whitewater rafting trip. And the theme is not just Lewis and Clark, but the great conservationists in the history of the American West. So lots and lots and lots going on, and you can contribute to the future of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We need it, and we love it, and we never take it for granted.
And with that, thank you again for listening. And now let's go to this week's program, Jefferson's First Cabinet. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me today is President Thomas Jefferson, and good to see you, Mr. Jefferson.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, I was hoping today that I could get you to talk about your first term as president, particularly how you formed a cabinet. You served on a cabinet that was marked by differences, and that would be the cabinet of George Washington, and not just differences of opinion, but it would seem strong differences of principle as well. Now, when you formed your cabinet, it is evident that you were looking for one of harmony.
Indeed, I was. So first of all, the cabinet is not specified or required under the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution recognizes that the president will have advisors and administrators, and so it's effectively opening the door to a cabinet. But the cabinet was the invention of George Washington, and he was taking his hints from British parliamentary government. So this was one of those areas where the British heritage of the country sort of bled over into our own system, even though it was not enumerated in the Constitution. When I became the president in 1801, I only had 4 cabinet officers: the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the Secretary of State. And then there was the Attorney General, who was not a full cabinet member, but was sort of a semi-cabinet member, and the Postmaster General. So at the maximum, you could say I had 6 cabinet ministers, really only 4. And that was the level of the federal government in our time. I had been through the Washington administration, where I served for about 3.5 years as the first Secretary of State. And unfortunately, the other members of Washington's cabinet were Federalists, particularly, of course, the High Federalist Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. And I found that experience so filled with conflict, so embittering, so unpleasant in every way, that I left well before Washington's term was up. I retired to Virginia thinking I was retiring for the last time. And I also determined if I ever happened to be the President of the United States, I would not make the mistake of having an inharmonious cabinet. So that was extremely important to me. And of course, I chose as my principal advisor, the Secretary of State, my closest friend and collaborator in life, James Madison. So that ensured that the two most important people in the government, the Secretary of State and the President, were in complete harmony. We were best friends, although that's a term we never used in our time, but you see my point. And I did this in large part because of what I had experienced in Washington's cabinet. And it's not that we never disagreed in my cabinet. We did sometimes, but it was always done with a great spirit of mutual respect and civility.
So you were looking to have men in your cabinet that shared your views. Now, I'm not suggesting that your cabinet was what we might call yes men today, sir, but were you considering the viewpoints of those who opposed you? In closing your first inaugural address, you said, quote, "When right, I shall often be thought wrong by those whose positions will not command a view of the whole ground. I ask your indulgence for my own errors, which will never be intentional, and your support against the errors of others, who may condemn what they would not if seen in all its parts."
I was concerned about two things. One was my own incapacities, my own weaknesses as a president and as a national administrator. And I knew that I would sometimes go wrong. I would make the wrong choices. I would err. But I promised the American people that my errors and my weaknesses were not of the heart. They would have been of the head. In other words, my purpose was, I think, something of great integrity, but what you actually decide in a moment of crisis is not always the best path. And so I warned the American people in advance that this was true, inevitably true, and that I was surrounding myself with people who could correct me and put me back on the right trail when I did go wrong. And then I secondly said, but I also understand that there are people who will always mischaracterize what I do deliberately or inadvertently, that they will either decide that they're never going to acknowledge even things that they approve of that happen to have come through me, or they can't see what I see. They don't have all the facts. They don't have all the documents. They don't have a full picture of what's unfolding. And so with the partial information that they have, they make judgments which they probably would not make if they were actually in the room. But you can't help that either. And so it really helps to have people around you who are not afraid to tell you the truth, including at times when you're wrong.
As I said, Mr. Jefferson, you had a great deal of prior experience in being in a cabinet, having attended, it is said, nearly 60 cabinet meetings when you were Secretary of State during the Washington administration. This must have helped you, sir.
Yes. I had great respect, of course, for George Washington. He handled all of his own correspondence. He had secretaries and amanuenses, but he read everything and dictated much of it and wrote some of it. And every piece of correspondence, every memo written by one of his cabinet ministers also went through him. He didn't always read them, of course, but he was always in a position to read every single piece of paper that was issued by his administration. Of course, that would seem ludicrous in your time, but it was still just possible in mine. And I followed Washington in that path. I made sure that everyone sent their paperwork through me as the third president so that I was in a position to know what was being done in my name. I was also able to be informed in ways that I might not otherwise be, and to intervene at times and to suggest a somewhat different approach to a problem. So I had learned a great deal from that. I also learned that it's just no good to have a cabinet of enemies. Of course, George Washington didn't know that Hamilton and I would be enemies. I didn't know it either. When I first came back to this country from France in the autumn of 1789, I had heard of Hamilton. I'd never met him. I'd heard great things about him, that he was a hero, that he had played a distinguished role at Yorktown, that he had been the principal private secretary of George Washington during the war, that this was a man of parts, as we would have said in my time. And so I was disposed to think well of him. But then when I actually got to know him, I felt that he was a dangerous man, overly ambitious, too fascinated by British habits and British traditions and parliamentary system and kings and nobles and lords and dukes and aristocrats, that his obsession with centralized finance was going to create problems of distributive justice in our society, and that he frankly meddled in the portfolios of other cabinet members and regarded himself effectively as the prime minister under the administration of Washington. And so we inevitably disagreed and came to blows, not physical blows, of course. And I left because I, first of all, didn't like it. I'm a harmony obsessive. And secondly, I don't think it's good for a presidential cabinet to have so much conflict. And so it's not that you want yes men. Of course you don't want that. But you want people of your own stamp. You want people who agree with your vision of government. You want people who understand the policies that you're trying to enact and approve of them. And you certainly don't want people who can't mix well with others. And so that was a very important negative lesson I learned. And then I learned a lesson, by the way, from John Adams. I was his vice president, so I was never part of his cabinet. And we had almost nothing to do with each other for those 4 years in his single term. But he made a colossal mistake, maybe the worst mistake of his life. When he became president, he kept Washington's cabinet intact. He could easily have said, "You've done well. Thank you for your service. I now must surround myself with people of my own stripe," but he didn't. He kept Washington's cabinet out of, I think, an irrational sense of loyalty to George Washington. And those people never respected Adams fully. They weren't candid with him, and he learned the hard way in the course of his single term that they were actually answering to Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was now in private law practice in New York. He was, in a sense, the shadow president of the United States, although Adams didn't know it, and so his cabinet was openly disloyal to him, to the point where it eventually led to crisis. And so I had these two negative experiences: one, by being in the cabinet of George Washington and seeing what can go wrong when there are enemies in it, and then secondly, seeing what can happen when a president does not produce a cabinet of people who share his vision and are essentially, I don't mean automatically or unendingly, but essentially loyal to him and not to someone else.
Mr. Jefferson, in reading about White House history, I found that you used a large room in the southwest corner of the first floor for your cabinet meetings, and it was a room that reflected your priorities, being surrounded by bookcases filled with books of interest to you. And I understand also that in this room, you created a number of workspaces used by your cabinet members during meetings, along with several large tables covered in a green felt-like fabric.
It's called baize, green baize. I think this later became the state dining room, but in my time, it was my principal office, and there was a large space, and there were different tables. I had all sorts of artifacts from the American West. I had busts of great figures, and then an enormous collection of books and scientific instruments and globes and so on. So this was a room. This is what an Enlightenment gentleman does. If he has the means, he creates a room that exhibits the range of his interests and provides him the tools, including books, that he needs to make sense of the world. And so a good place to hold a cabinet meeting, because then the people around me would have a sense, just by sitting there, of what I valued, and it would often be the subject of an early conversation. So we might talk for a short time about the woolly mammoth before we turn to policies with respect to France or Britain.
We're talking with President Jefferson this week about how he formed his first cabinet. And Mr. Jefferson, we need to take a short break, but we'll return in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. This week, we're speaking with President Jefferson about how he formed his first cabinet. Mr. Jefferson, we were talking about the room that you chose. I have read, sir, that you also demanded that this space remain private, and you only allowed servants into the room who were illiterate to avoid anyone going through your papers or reading any of your notes.
I always worried about questions of security. I'm a very private man. I'm very careful with communication. I had a cipher system, as you know, several different types for coded messages involving politically sensitive matters, sometimes diplomatic matters. The difference between the post office in your time and mine is that in mine, postmasters were unscrupulous and often opened other people's mail and then resealed them and would actually read my letters or Hamilton's letters or Madison's letters or Washington's letters out loud in their post offices to friends and strangers. And people would even take out extracts, copy out extracts of other people's letters and use them, not to blackmail them, but to expose their political or private positions. And so security was a bigger issue in the post office, at least in my time, than it is in yours. And I had these cipher systems. And I also will say, and I know this does not put me in a particularly favorable light, that I did not like having slaves in the room, because a conversation will naturally turn on a whole range of issues, sometimes involving policies with respect to slavery. And I didn't want the enslaved people to be listening in on these conversations. I also felt that there was no way to control the kind of gossip that might occur, that state secrets might be inadvertently exposed by people coming in and out of these rooms. And so I was very careful to lock things up, to cover things up, and to avoid allowing much traffic in what in my time would be the equivalent of the Oval Office in yours.
Well, I find this very interesting that you were so guarded about the space, and I understand why. It was wise thinking on your part, sir. Lindsay M. Chervinsky, a former White House historian who I've had the pleasure to speak to, wrote about your cabinet meetings, saying, by controlling the meeting space, Jefferson was able to keep close tabs on their conversations, unlike President Washington, who sometimes instructed his secretaries to meet and report back with their determination. Jefferson trusted his subordinates, but did not want them meeting without him, indicating that his leadership style was meticulous, hands-on, and designed to protect presidential authority. Did she get it about right, sir?
Very well stated. It's an excellent analysis. I only add to this, lest people think that I was a paranoid, that I had suffered from leaks, what you call leaks. And the most famous of these situations was a letter that I wrote to an Italian patriot friend of mine named Philip Mazzei. And in that letter, I said, you would be astonished to see people who were Samsons in the field and Solomons in the temple have had their hair shorn by the harlot England. In other words, you'd be surprised that George Washington, who was a Samson-like warrior in the field and a brilliant counselor in the cabinet, Solomon, has allowed his hair to be shorn, as Samson was, thus making him impotent, by, in this case, the harlot England rather than Delilah. And it was an unfortunate phrase, and the letter was leaked. Mazzei, unfortunately, allowed it to be printed. When it came back to the United States from Italy, it caused an enormous uproar, a furor, and there were people who never got over it. There were people who never trusted me again. And Washington himself was deeply hurt by that phrase and that leaked letter. This was not the only time in my life that this happened. And so I became very concerned about leaks and about being exposed in this way. And so when I adopted these measures of privacy and even secrecy, they may seem to be paranoid to your world, but they certainly weren't. They were necessary measures of security in a very different technology.
Well, because you approved of Miss Chervinsky's writing. Let me offer a couple of more paragraphs from her. She wrote, Jefferson's careful attention to cabinet management paid off. He had the lowest cabinet turnover in United States history, only finding replacements for his attorneys general when they became ill or died.
It's true. As I left the presidency in 1809, I said I believe that I have had the most harmonious cabinet in history, and probably it will continue to be the model of the most harmonious cabinet as American history unfolds. And of course, central to this was my chief minister, the Secretary of State, James Madison. Henry Dearborn of Massachusetts was my Secretary of War. Robert Smith of Maryland was my Secretary of the Navy. And my Secretary of the Treasury was a man as gifted as Alexander Hamilton himself, Albert Gallatin, Swiss-born, French-speaking, a citizen of the United States, a brilliant Republican activist from Pennsylvania now, and also a truly great Secretary of the Treasury. Levi Lincoln was my first Attorney General, but these proved to be extraordinary men, all with great harmony. The only one that I ever really had any conflict with was Robert Smith of the Navy, because I wanted to reduce the size of the Navy pretty severely. And of course, his job was to not only support me, but to make sure that the Navy was a viable force in the event of war. And so we sometimes struggled over Navy budgets. The problem with the Navy is that it's just so ruinously expensive. Boats rot. And so I was automatically at odds with Robert Smith because I never could get enough money squeezed out of the naval budget. And he, of course, was trying to maintain it as a secure fighting force.
Sir, during my time, it's quite a process for cabinet members to be selected. They go through an intense vetting, and in your time, you knew these gentlemen. How did you go about selecting them?
Well, Madison was obvious. He was a gifted man, a deep and penetrating thinker. He had helped to give us the Constitution of the United States. He drafted the Bill of Rights. He was the nation's leading authority on constitutional questions. He was a fellow Virginia planter. We agreed profoundly on questions of separation of church and state and freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. You have a term in your time, which I would never have used, of course, but you say no-brainer. Think how vulgar a phrase that is, but that certainly was the nature of that appointment. There was no question that he was going to be my Secretary of State and my presumed successor. At that time, the path to the presidency came through the Secretary of State more than from any other position, including the vice presidency. Then Robert Smith was the hardest person to get into my cabinet because nobody wanted to be the Secretary of the Navy when it was known that I was no friend to the Navy, and so nobody wanted to be in charge of a shrinking portfolio and one that was constantly in danger of collapse. Henry Dearborn was a very good man for Secretary of War. The problem in my cabinet was Gallatin, because the Federalists were so vicious that they did not want to confirm him, that they disliked him because he had been a partisan Republican in the Congress of the United States. He had been a thorn in their side. And so when I nominated him to be the Secretary of the Treasury, they made it clear that they might not confirm him, which is appalling, but this happens in politics. And so I made him a recess appointment. You can do this under our Constitution. If the Congress is not meeting, you can appoint somebody and the recesses were endless in my time. They only met for a few weeks per year. And so I made a recess appointment of him. And then when Congress eventually came back, he had been in office long enough that they finally shrugged their shoulders and let him remain. But if I had put his name forward during a session of the Congress, they might well have refused to seat him. And so that was the only time I had to use anything like, I won't say subterfuge, because it's a power clearly given to the president under the Constitution, but it's not something that I would have preferred.
It's apparent, sir, that you had a great understanding of how a harmonious cabinet would aid you in your presidency. Returning to Lindsay Chervinsky's writings, she wrote, while the secretaries didn't always agree with Jefferson, they supported his policies, never sought to undermine his agenda, and didn't compete with him for power. As a result, they served as an incredibly persuasive tool for public outreach, congressional cooperation, and diplomatic negotiations. High praise for you, sir.
I was very cautious in my selection of my cabinet ministers, and I chose extraordinary men. Of course, I didn't have that many slots to fill, and so I was able to choose nothing but the very best. We did sometimes disagree, but we did not ever leave the cabinet meeting in rancor or mutual distrust. They all knew, for example, that I took their opinions very seriously, that their voices would be heard, that I was persuadable, that I could be talked down from a bad position. But they also knew that in the end, I and I alone had to make the decision, and that once I had made the decision, they would get behind it. And they knew this and were willing to do this, sir, because they knew that I did take them seriously. In other words, if I had just brushed them off or not consulted them, they might have just reason to complain about my policy decisions, but they knew that I was deeply respectful of what they had to say and that nobody's opinions were dismissed out of hand or ignored, and that made them more willing to honor such decisions as I finally made. I can think of two times when we really disagreed, and one was, well, maybe more than two. One certainly was about women. Gallatin at some point said to me, he was European. He said, women hold public office and vote in France. Maybe we ought to consider that here. And I said, this, sir, is a proposition that the American people are not prepared for, nor am I. And that was the end of that story. And we disagreed slightly about what to do with respect to the Barbary pirates. The Barbary pirates were preying upon our merchant shipping in the Mediterranean and taking American merchantmen hostage and torturing them or forcing them to convert to Islam. And it was a mess, ransoming these people at enormous cost. And my first cabinet meeting, in fact, the very first of all my cabinet meetings, occurred in May of 1801. So I'd been president for a couple of months, and this was about the Barbary crisis. And we were trying to decide what's the right thing to do here. And I wanted to wait for Congress to act. But my fellow cabinet ministers said, well, wait a minute. The Congress is not in session. It's impossible to gather them up quickly. Surely the president, as commander-in-chief, has not only the right but the duty to protect the security of Americans during his time in office if Congress is not available to consult. And so they talked me into taking a more independent executive stand than I was really comfortable with. But I agreed with them that something had to be done, and we weren't able to wait for Congress to take the lead.
Talking about the conflict in your cabinet, sir, you worked to avoid that conflict. In fact, I have read that you rarely held cabinet meetings hoping to minimize the chance of conflict. Is that true, sir?
Yes, but it wasn't really for that purpose primarily. The primary purpose was not to waste time. Not everything is a cabinet discussion. And I had a very lively correspondence with each of my cabinet ministers. We were all clustered around the White House. It was an easy walk to any one of the offices. And I would simply go see the cabinet member or send a note asking him to stop by the White House. And so there was a lot of bilateral communication between me and Gallatin, or between me and Dearborn, or between me and Robert Smith. We met for cabinet meetings when there was something that bled over several portfolios, something that was truly corporate in function. But I didn't like the idea of cabinet meetings because I had been soured on them. How can I say this? And this would even be true in my cabinet, although much more true in others. Powerful men like to talk, and powerful men will talk even when they have nothing to say. People who are in positions of power feel that it's incumbent upon them to have opinions and to hold forth. They can't help it. That's why legislative bodies are so dreary, because instead of just saying what's on your mind, people say what's on their mind 7 or 8 times in different ways and repeat themselves. And then the second person stands up and essentially repeats what the first person said in his own way. And so that kind of ego, that sort of amor proprio, self-love, that desire to hold forth is one of the unfortunate characteristics of humankind. I prefer just to work something out with Gallatin in private where he felt no need to hold forth, and nor did I.
When we think about the cabinet, where did that rank in importance of the decisions that you made, sir?
Not very high. First of all, I had implicit trust in Madison. We met constantly. It's one of the problems, actually, for biographers, because when we weren't in the same space, we corresponded. When we were in the same community, we tended to talk things through. And although we would each provide a memo, in most cases, it was a very short memo. So historians wish we had written down more than we did during the years when we were in daily communication with each other, not only as cabinet ministers, but then I would have these dinner parties at the White House, and the Madisons were very often invited, of course. Dolly Madison can enliven any social group anywhere at any time, and her sparkling and charismatic personality, infinitely greater than that of her husband, by the way, really provided some wonderful social glue and oil in a world that was often filled with disharmonies of one sort or another, or conflicts. So I didn't have to communicate that much with James Madison in that way, because he could think for me. He could think better than I did, and he knew when I was getting a little out of hand and could bring me back down to earth pretty quickly. And the others were people of my own stamp. If anything, Albert Gallatin was a stronger, small R Republican than I was. They all were for limited government. We shared a philosophy of America. We didn't have to struggle very much. We were in agreement about all of the major policies, and the only disagreements came about how to implement our broad policies. And Gallatin was constantly urging frugality, as he should, because I had made it clear to him that reducing the national debt as severely as possible was the number one purpose of my administration. And so that was his obsession, to try to fulfill that vision. And then I would have a plan, like the Lewis and Clark expedition, or some internal improvements, or a national university, or something else. And Gallatin would have to say, Mr. President, I remind you that you hired me to be frugal. So when you come to me with these expensive projects, I'm going to have to oppose you. I will do it generously, but my duty is to remind you that your number one priority is fiscal responsibility. And so this sort of, I'm calling it almost a teasing sort of argumentation, continued. I can't remember a single time when anyone left angry.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jefferson, for sharing these insights about the choices of your first cabinet and how it operated. We so appreciate it. Right now, sir, we need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, out of character now. My tights and wig have been put back into the rotating closet at Monticello. And across from me is the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson.
Across from you and Mr. Jefferson virtually, it's the age we live in.
It works, and it's a strange world. I'm sitting here in my home studio looking at a 6-foot by 3-foot black and white photograph of Hiroshima, the mushroom cloud at Hiroshima. We wonder why I don't get any dates.
I don't even know if I want to ask where you got that and why you have it.
Well, I'm giving this, I'm doing this retreat on J. Robert Oppenheimer and the making of the atomic bomb and the decision to use the bomb.
Of course, yes.
And so I ordered up this. I thought I would use it as a backdrop, and now it's hanging in my living room. And so I'm guessing I'm the only person in North Dakota with a large photograph of a weapon of mass destruction on his living room wall, and it's certainly not very Jeffersonian.
What an interesting character. We should devote some time in a future program to talk about Oppenheimer. Really an interesting character. But meanwhile, it was great to talk to Jefferson this week about his cabinet. In fact, it's been great to talk to him the last couple of weeks about his. Last week we talked about his first inauguration speech, and this week about him forming a cabinet, and really a successful cabinet. He's sort of like, how did you choose these guys? Well, he knew them all, and they were all people who shared his views. But it was a real key to his successful first term.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to send out praise to Lindsay Chervinsky, who was on the Jefferson Hour talking about her book on the Washington administration cabinet, her first book. She was then a White House Association historian, has now moved on to other things. But the article that you found on the White House Historical Association website about Jefferson's cabinet is really first rate. I think even better than the insights of her book on the Washington cabinet, and she nailed it. She understands that it was, and I want to just linger on this for a minute, David, that it was essential to Jefferson's character and personality and style that he have around him people who harmonized in a deep way with his view of the world and with his own leadership style. In other words, he's asking for people to be not yes men, certainly not, but to be deeply devoted to the same ideal that Jefferson had, and to his very personal style, which depended upon so much civility and harmony. Jefferson couldn't raise his voice. He couldn't get angry. He couldn't have a confrontation. He got ill, physically ill under such circumstances. And so he's a bit of a sensitive plant. You sort of have to tiptoe a little around Thomas Jefferson, but they all realized that it was worth it. That's my point, is that he's not an easy man, because he's suave and he's civil and he's always gentlemanly and polite and speaks in complete sentences and could never say a negative thing about somebody in their presence. But he also is a little delicate. And so people realize, he says, you don't just go in and swashbuckle around with ideas with Jefferson. It's not like that. You have to sort of bend over backwards to adopt this kind of strangely intimate, harmonious presidential style. But if you do, the payoff is so great. They all understood that it's worth it. Jefferson's worth it. He's unusual, but man, is he an extraordinary human being. And to work for somebody like that is an honor. It's like you don't get this experience more than once in a lifetime, where you meet somebody of this genius. And so I think she got it, that he knew that he had to have that cabinet. And he had certainly seen from the debacle of the Adams cabinet, loyal to Hamilton, and the chaos of the Washington cabinet, where he once said that he and Hamilton were like, two roosters in a cockfight. And I'm sure he's exaggerating, but it had to be horrible for Jefferson to be in these mano-a-mano kind of crises, conflicts with Hamilton, because it was so deeply part of Hamilton's style and so alien to Jefferson's style. And yet he felt so strongly about the policy questions that he had to hang in there and take the abuse, whereas he would much rather have just disappeared, and eventually he did.
There was a couple of things I took away from her article. She's not the only source of this, but that found it very interesting. Jefferson had his private study, which became the room where his cabinet met. And, I talked to him about, he created workspaces for his cabinet members, and these long tables with a green felt. What did he call that?
Baize. It's green baize, B-A-I-Z-E.
And, how he really wanted to control that workspace. I thought that was brilliant.
Well, he's one of the most organized people who ever lived on Earth. Period. Jefferson knew where everything was. Nothing was ever out of place. He was an indefatigable record keeper. He alphabetized and organized and had classification systems. He loved charts. He loved graphs. He just loved organizing. Of course, this was the Enlightenment, which was the age of taxonomy. And Jefferson was like, he had a mania for this. And so he wanted everything in its place. And there is actually a wonderful painting of this that we'll post that I was able to publish, thanks to the White House Historical Association, of Jefferson and Meriwether Lewis in that room. And it has all the accoutrements and maps and globes and the pet bird and flowers on the windowsill and paleontological tools and paleontological fossils and so on. And so I made a quiz out of it for readers of We Proceeded On, the Lewis and Clark Quarterly, which I edit. And I said, how many of these things can you identify? And there were theodolites and surveyor's tools. And it's like, it would be a jumble if it were in somebody's garage. But Jefferson had absolutely everything in precisely the right place. And so he had different tables for different purposes. And so if the cabinet meeting starts to talk about problems in Texas, Jefferson could say, let's go over to the map area. And they would all, four of them, get up and go over to the map area. And Jefferson would go to his 27 maps rolled up, and he'd say, oh, this one, oh, there it is. And he'd bring it out and roll it out. And they'd put weights on the sides, and then they would study the map. And then if someone said, oh, the prospect between here and the Potomac needs a new building, Jefferson said, well, let's all go to the window. And he just loved this kind of, that he could organize reality to suit his hobbies, his commitments, his vocations, his obsessions, his peculiar way of seeing. And so I would give I'd never seen this room. You described it beautifully from Lindsay's article. I'd never seen the room. I couldn't really envision it. And then when I saw this painting, which was made available by the White House Historical Association, you can Google it. Just type Meriwether Lewis and Jefferson in the state dining room.
This is the Peter Waddell painting?
Yeah, it's fabulous. And so then when I saw it, I thought a couple of things. First of all, I thought how quintessentially Thomas Jefferson this is. I mean, this is exactly what you would expect.
Right down to him sitting in a robe and slippers with his feet up on a chair.
And that robe is a Persian garment that Enlightenment figures wore. That this was a kind of a bathrobe. It's called a banyan. You can buy them. I bought one on the internet because, of course, I have to be a pretended figure of the Enlightenment. But they wore these. This was an Oriental idea, when the Orient meant Persia. And so people had these turbans and they had these banyans and they would sit in them. And so there is Jefferson in his banyan and Lewis is in, looking much more like a traditional 18th century gentleman. And all around him are all of these Jeffersonian accoutrements.
Yeah, it's complete with his mockingbird dick flying through the room.
Exactly. And there's if you look at it, there's an image of Maria Cosway up over the fireplace, and which wouldn't have been there, by the way, but and all these scientific instruments. So first of all, when I saw it, I thought, how fabulous that Peter Waddell has gone into the archives, these very letters that we're talking about, and he's reconstructed what the room must have looked like. That was my first response. And my second response was, wouldn't it be something to have a Renaissance man or woman as the president of the United States again? Wouldn't it be something to have a president who acknowledged the primacy of science, who was well-read in the arts and the humanities? And I'm not talking about President
I need
Trump.
to pull you back to reality, sir. There is one other thing that I wanted you to comment on, and that was the fact that he would not let any servants into the cabinet room unless they were illiterate, because he was worried about them reading his notes.
I have some slight doubt about that. I'm not disputing it, but it feels like it's been slightly taken out of context. Jefferson was clearly obsessive about privacy and even secrecy, way beyond any diplomatic need. It just was part of his character. But he was always anxious about slavery. He brought slaves with him to the White House. I hate to even think that, but he staffed the White House principally with enslaved people from Monticello. It is at least possible that Sally Hemings gave birth to a child in the White House. There's a whole world of this that has not been properly or exhaustively investigated. Of course, and Jefferson did not want the world to know much about this. But so there's that. So there's the problem of race and slavery, but there's also the secrecy, and there's also the sense of fastidiousness. Imagine being the housemaid who comes into that room and starts to move things around. Jefferson's going to be like, "Oh wait, don't move that inkstand. I have it precisely where I want it. Please don't touch that
But
map."
Jefferson had suffered at the hands of those who had surreptitiously read his papers or his mail. It would be understandable that he would do everything he could to keep his privacy about those papers and his cabinet's work.
Yes, of course. And the Matsai letter that I referred to, I mean, that was one of the most controversial things that ever happened. It seems so harmless. You would be surprised that men who were Samsons in the field and Solomons in the temple have had their hair shorn by the harlot England. That was like, I don't even know. I mean, it'd be like the Pentagon Papers when it was released. It was just, it just shocked the world, and people lost respect for Jefferson. I think one of the high Federalists said, I think it was Robert Morris, it might have been Gouverneur Morris, said the manners and morals of a man who wrote the Matsey letter cannot be pure. It was that big a deal. And so Jefferson understood there's no guarantee of privacy. And of course, we just learned this, in the 2016 election, the Democratic National Headquarters was hacked. Those private emails, some of which were very unsavory to read, were leaked to the public. Leakage has been an issue from the very beginning of American life, and even with our coding systems, it's not always possible to prevent them. And Jefferson was paranoid about this, even though he says he wasn't. And so it doesn't surprise me one bit that he was very cautious about who had access to that room. Remember, at Monticello, he had a key to his private suite, and the only other people who had that key were his daughter Martha, who was almost always there when he was, and of course, Sally Hemings, who was the housemaid for that suite of rooms. In other words, aside from whatever romantic or sexual liaison they had, she was also the maid of that suite of rooms for Jefferson. And so he wouldn't let people in there. And when people wanted to use Jefferson's library, he always made them use it there where he could supervise them like the creepiest librarian you've ever met. And just like, hey, don't fold that book down. Don't put your coffee there. You can't borrow that book.
One thing I didn't ask Jefferson about was a comparison of cabinets. I think immediately of Lincoln and his often called team of rivals.
Yeah, Lincoln, and of course the famous book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, that Obama had all of his cabinet members read and his staff members read when he became president. It's a great book, and Lincoln was a hotly contested presidential candidate. He had to sneak into Washington, D.C. because there were assassination plots. He had a really difficult run, and there were people in the Republican Party, which was kind of just born, it was a brand new party, who loathed him and thought that he was a lightweight and that he was just a hick from Illinois. And so he decided to make a virtue out of this fact, and he hired his arch rivals to be important cabinet ministers. And so Team of Rivals looks at that sort of a leadership style. And I guess the point I would make about this, David, is that there's no one presidential leadership style. Every president is a different cat. Every president has a different background, style, tradition, approach, a different set of concerns. For example, FDR loved to have people in his cabinet who were competing. He would set people against each other. He would create internecine squabbles in his administration because he thought that this would help to flush out ideas and clarify them. Jefferson couldn't have done that if you'd paid him $1 gazillion.
And it's very interesting that he had the lowest cabinet turnover of any president in history. Sadly, sir, we need to bring this conversation to a close. Any last thoughts? And of course, any last updates on your endeavors?
Well, the Constitution courses, I really urge people to sign up for. They're some of the best things I've ever had the opportunity to do, and my, do we need it. And we're living in a time of great constitutional disruption and consternation. And so this is, it's nonpartisan, it's entertaining, it's just looking at what the founders intended, what we got, how it's been amended, where it is now, how we might wish to amend it, how well we're holding up as a constitutional republic. And so people can go to Jefferson Hour site on that. I also really encourage people to come to Cuba in March. I know it sounds a little odd in the time of pandemic, and the Trump administration did everything it could to slam the door shut on Americans going to Cuba. That's changed already. And the person who leads this tour with me, Wayne Fairchild of Missoula, Montana, has been to Cuba 20 times. He's a master at this. And so we have a great time. So if you'd like to go to Cuba, go to the website. Also, my books, the summer tours, both the Lewis and Clark tour and the Salmon River tour. We're going to do an online course on Hamlet, and on and on and on. So just go to jeffersonhour.com for all of that. But if you want to go to Cuba, now is the time to do it. All the legalities are in place, and we have a master coordinator in Wayne Fairchild. So those are the things I have to suggest today. But I want to say that how much I'm enjoying 2021, David. We talked about Jefferson's inauguration, and for the first time in the whole history of the Jefferson Hour, we talked Jefferson into reading his entire first inaugural address. I don't know how you pulled that off, because he's not the kind of person who wants to do that, but you did. And this week, Lindsay Travinsky is emerging as a very serious presidential scholar, and she was on the show last year. I think we should get her back on.
She had a great book, The Cabinet, that we both read and enjoyed very much.
And then, of course, we need to bring in the reigning champion, Dr. Joseph Ellis, who's been unusually quiet. Have you heard from him?
And not recently. I think his football team lost, and he's sad.
So we'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.